Hello and welcome to week number 5 of plant biology here at NICC. This week we will be continuing our reading in chapter 30 of the Biology 2E textbook. So we're still in the same chapter we were in last week, but we're moving into 30.4 where we start talking about leaves, 30.5 when you talk about transport of water and solutes, and 30.6 where we talk about plant sensory systems and responses. When we think of a typical plant, again, we can separate into the shoot and the root system. And last week we talked more about the root system and parts of the shoot system. But this week, as we talk about leaves, these are definitely part of the shoot system. So these leaves are usually above ground. I can't think of any below ground leaves. They may exist. I'm just not aware of them. But when we talk about leaves, they're going to have a typical basic sort of structure. They can come in many different shapes, but they will all have the same sort of structure where they have this leaf blade called the lamina, which is usually the widest part of the leaf. If they're attached to the stem, that structure is called a petiole. They have venation, or these veins throughout the leaf, and that's for the flow of water and sugars and things like that through the leaf. Venation pattern on the leaves is an important identifying characteristic for plants. When we look at the difference between monocots and dicots, how those leaf veins spread out throughout that leaf are going to help us determine what sort of leaf they are. Monocots are going to have this parallel venation. Dicots are going to have this net-like venation. And you can think of that difference if you think of, say, a blade of grass where you have these very clear parallel lines running through the blade of the leaf, or say an oak tree where you have these very net-like patterns. The book also gives the example of a dicot that has sort of a parallel, but not quite parallel venation pattern with the ginkgo. Ginkgos are a strange sort of tree, and they're going to come up a number of times when we're talking about maybe some exceptions to rules and things like that. But ginkgos are definitely dichotomous trees. When we talk about leaf arrangement can also be very important when we're determining what type of plant we're talking about. Whether these the leaves come off the stem like this, whether they come off staggered, or whether they come off in whorls, really has a strong determining factor on plant identification, and it's a primary sort of biological point that people use when we're identifying plants. So whether the plants are opposite, alternate, or sort of whirled off the base, again, is this identifying characteristic, but also what sort of form does the leaf take is also important as well. Simple leaves, that's where the blades are completely undivided. Again, the example they give in the book, there in figure 30.23 is the banana leaf. Good, big, flat, sort of standard kind of leaf. Nothing too exciting there. But leaves can also be subdivided, and if we get these divisions in the leaf, then we start calling them compound leaves. We can have what are called palmately compound leaves, where we have the spread of the leaf blades, or the leaf blades in this sort of hand-shaped sort of fashion. So we can have palmately compound. If we have a long leaf with little leaflets setting off the side, we call that pinnately compound. So there's a difference in these sorts of compoundedness if we're going to have these divided leaves. If we start looking at the inside of a leaf specifically, not at their gross anatomy, but more at the microscopic level, we can look and see that leaves have these very distinct layers, which shouldn't be surprising. I mean, they are complex organisms, not, again, unlike, say, humans are. And so we should be not surprised that they have complex structures within their leaves. They're not simply flat sheets. So they have this depth to them. On the outer and upper layer is what's known as the upper epidermis, covered by usually a waxy cuticle to help prevent water loss. This middle layer of the leaf is called the mesophyll, where we have the parenchyma cells or the palisade parenchyma and the spongy parenchyma, and that's sort of where the meat of the action of the leaves happens in these mesophyll cells. And on the lower level, we also have an epidermis, which may or may not have some cuticle, but also on the lower level, we have these stoma, which allow air and moisture to move in and out of the mesophyll of these leaves. So respiration within these leaves happens at these points, and these stoma are protected on the outsides by guard cells, which open and close sort of like this to allow more airflow through, less airflow through, but also if we're limiting airflow, we're also limiting water loss. So a lot of water is lost through the stoma from the leaves, which if you're a plant, water loss is definitely a stress that you don't have a lot of control over because you're immobile. You can't change how much water you have access to, so you have to be able to control that water, and this is the way that plants do that, through these guard cells through the stoma. Not surprisingly, there is a lot of diversity and adaptation with leaves. So for example, a cactus spine is actually a modified leaf. It's non-photosynthetic, but it's been adapted to this highly arid environment, so there's huge water pressure on cacti. And so these leaves have shrunk to the point where there's simply just a little spine off the side of the succulent stem of the plant. We can also see modification of leaves, such as pitcher plants or the Venus flytrap, where these leaves have actually been modified to capture insects so that the plant can then absorb nutrients from those insects. They do not absorb any energy resources from those insects, just the nutrients, primarily phosphorus, nitrogen, from those insects that the plant can then use because they tend to grow in nutrient-poor areas. Since we're talking about leaves, we should also talk about water potential and how water moves through plants in general. This section of this textbook has a fair bit of math in it. I am not concerned if you guys understand the math there. What I want you guys to understand are the concepts that are driving this movement of water through these plants. And so when we're going to look at how water is moving through these plants, it's going to move in a couple of different ways. We're going to have this sort of water pressure, where the water is sort of exerting its own sort of osmotic pressure to move itself through the plant. Gravity is going to be moving water through the plant, and we're also going to be able to move water up through the stems because water is both adhesive and cohesive and can stick to the sides of the xylem elements and move up and out and then be evaporated out through the leaves through this process called transpiration. Again, much more important than understanding the math of this, which, if you're interested in going into studying how water moves through plants, would be important for the purposes of this class. Again, conceptually, I want you guys to understand these processes. I'm not concerned about the specifics of the math. So it's important to understand the basics of how water is moving through these plant structures, sort of up and down through plants, because water is moving differently whether it's moving up or it's down, but also how plants are controlling these rates of transpiration. Most plants have a waxy cuticle that covers the outside of the leaves to prevent just sort of off-gassing of water. Water is a precious resource. In some cases, there's so much water that plants have this waxy cuticle to prevent water from moving into the plants, but management of water is a major critical component when you're talking about plants. If we're talking about transport of water, we also have to talk about the transport of sugars. So these photosynthates, the stuff that leaves make as part of the photosynthetic process, is an energy source that the plant then uses. And so go through that part of the chapter as well and understand that we're using these sort of osmotic pressures to drive the sucrose or the sugar through the plant as well. So lots of interesting sorts of ideas in this transportation sort of section. Don't get bogged down in the math. Don't get intimidated by the math of it, but understand conceptually what's going on. As we move forward through the chapter also, we're going to look at tropisms. And these tropisms are plants' responses to environmental stimuli. So they respond to light, they respond to touch, they respond to gravity. Sometimes they respond to chemical signals. These sorts of ways that plants respond and grow in response to these stimuli are called tropisms. When plants are responding to light or sort of light stimuli, we call that phototropism. So plants generally in the shoot system grow toward light. In the root system, generally grow away from light. Different types of light can also send signals to plants as far as what time of year it is, whether they should be flowering, whether they should be producing fruit, what sorts of pheromones they may be sending out into the environment to stimulate other sorts of responses. So light plays a critical role in how plants understand their environment. So understanding those sorts of pressures on plants is important. Gravity obviously is a huge stressor on plants. It's a huge stressor on animals too. So the building of muscle tissue in animals is often a response to gravity. If you lift weights, you're lifting those weights against gravity. That stimulates muscle growth. Plants don't have muscles per se, but they definitely respond to gravity in what's known as gravitropism. Some parts of the plant have negative gravitropism where they grow against gravity, or positive gravitropism where they grow with gravity. Again, the separation between root and shoot often plays a critical sort of breaking point depending on where these plants are going to, or which direction these plants are going to respond. When we're looking at these tropic sort of responses, auxin is going to be a major class of hormones that are going to be driving these sorts of growth responses. So we can have auxins. We can also have cytokinins, which really aid in these stimulating growth factors as well, and gibberellins. So if we look at, say, figure 30.40 in the book, these grapes have this huge size because the plants have been sprayed with gibberellic acid, which promotes the stem elongation, which sort of just gives more room for these grapes to grow. So if you go to the local grocery store and you see these big giant grapes, it's because they've been treated hormonally out in the field to produce these sort of extra sizes. It's just a plant hormonal response to a stimulating sort of hormone. Abscisic acid is talked about in the book, as is ethylene. Ethylene plays a critical role with fruit ripening and flower wilting. So that maturation, especially this time of year, as we have plants sort of dying and dropping, ethylene plays an important role. There's also a few non-traditional sorts of hormones that the book talks about. Go through those and understand those as well. But plants also respond to touch, and sort of wind is, you can sort of think of wind as touch as well. Here in Iowa, we have these sort of traditional sort of what are known as open-grown oak trees, where you have this big giant oak tree, usually has a big trunk, sort of a round bushy top with branches reaching way out. We don't get that unless those oak trees are grown in this open sort of prairie setting. If those same oak trees were grown in a woodlot where there's lots of trees next to each other, they'll grow very straight and tall without that branching, and that's a response to that wind pressure. And so this pressure of touch and wind plays a significant role in plant development and how plants move. If you think about a grapevine twining around something, also a touch response called thigmotropism. And plants use these thigmotropic responses to either move towards or away from these stimuli, depending on what part of the plant they are, what kind of plant they are, and sort of what the purpose of these structures is on the plant. There are also defense responses from plants. Plants don't like to get eaten. They don't want to be eaten. They've spent a lot of time and effort collecting energy from the sun for themselves. They don't want to give it to you. They don't want to give it to other herbivores. And so they've developed these responses or protections against herbivory. They can be physical. So if you have like a thick, waxy cuticle that's just hard to eat through, that's an herbivory defense. If they have spines, definitely an herbivory defense. Sometimes plants can produce toxic substances. There are toxic substances galore in the plant kingdom. Some people use those toxic substances for recreational purposes. Some people get very sick from those toxic substances, and it really depends on what sort of substance we're talking about. Caffeine, probably the #1 stimulant in the world, is a plant defense mechanism. If you're not expecting to be super stimulated by a plant and you eat it and you don't like it, you're probably going to avoid that in the future. So lots of good discussion points today talking about leaves, leaf morphology, leaf changes, leaf defense mechanisms, and water movement through the plant. So have a great week, and we'll talk to you next week.